You're probably familiar with the line, there is no rest for the, well, in Judaism we say for the good guys. But there are two versions in the Gemara of who exactly the good guys are, which effectively speaks to two major areas of how we serve Hashem, and a question about how each of those translates into the experience of the soul in the next world. Because it shouldn't be exactly the same. And yet, these two versions seem to indicate that there's something similar about both approaches. So in the Maimer Azal B'Sim Masechta Brachos, there's a statement of our sages at the end of the Gemara Brachos, and Al Derech Zeh B'Sim Masechta Moed Katan. It's also repeated at the end of Moed Katan. Zainudot Tzvei Gersos, the two versions. One is Aleph, Talmidei Chachamim Ein Lehem Menucha. Scholars of Torah have no rest, Lo B'Olam Hazeh V'Lo B'Olam Haba Chulei, neither in this world nor in the next. And the second is based, Tzadikim Ein Lehem Menucha Chulei. Righteous people have no rest. And in fact, that particular version is actually quoted in a whole host of different places all over. So what's the difference between Talmidei Chachamim and Tzadikim? Perhaps the distinction between these two versions, represents two different messages, really, two different types of content. If we go with a version that says it's the Torah scholars who have no rest, then then obviously what the Gemara is referring to is some greatness that is found specifically when you learn Torah. So that's why it's the Torah scholars who don't rest. Kidil Kamon, right? Talmidei Chachamim Kidil Kamon, as we'll explain. Whereas if you go with the other opinion that says that it's tzaddikim who never rest, well then then it would appear that the Gemara is not highlighting the uniqueness of studying Torah. Because the term tzaddik might also refer to a person who's not necessarily a Torah scholar, but is very dedicated to mitzvah observance, without being a Torah scholar. So, two possibilities. Are we lauding the greatness of Torah learning or the greatness of performance of mitzvahs? And darf man verstehen, dem Tam achiluk zwischen die zwei Shittas, seeing as there are clearly two opinions over here, let's understand why there would be two opinions. And in order to do that, let's understand, what does it mean that they don't rest? Why don't they rest? Isn't that what's supposed to happen after 120 years? You get to rest. The reason Talmidei Chachamim don't rest is the Arizal Masbin Nekuta Hashas. The Arizal explains because in the next world, after a person passes away, Talmidei Chachamim oiskim b'Torah. The Talmidei Chachamim who learned Torah in this world continue to learn Torah in the next world, and in doing so, they constantly are upgraded and elevated from one level to the next, from one type of Torah study and one environment of Torah study to another. And then he says, just as the Eibishter is infinite, so Hashem's Torah, because Torah and Hashem are one, is also infinite. So there's always room for growth, always room for upgrade, and therefore those people who engage in Torah in this world, in the next world, keep going higher and higher. They don't rest. So we can understand, that would explain the version that says that it's the Torah scholars who have no rest in the next world. For them, Dafka Torah, because it's Dafka Torah. To put it into language that fits the halachic terminology of Torah. For mitzvahs Talmud Torah, the object of this mitzvah, which is Torah study, is an infinite object. Therefore, there is no end to the progression and the elevation of von Gavra, of the operator, the performer of the mitzvah, from mitzvahs Talmud Torah, who fulfills the mitzvah of learning Torah, from Talmidei Chachamim, who are the Torah scholars who dedicate their lives to learning Torah. So it makes sense. They're dealing with an infinite commodity, so they keep growing infinitely, even in the next world. And Talmidei Chachamim makes sense that they should be the ones who have no rest. Aber mitzvahs, by comparison, however, mitzvahs are quite finite. Yes, of course, mitzvahs are Hashem's instructions. And Hashem is infinite. That's true. But the mitzvahs themselves, von deswegen is in the mitzvah itself, in zeir chefza, in the actual product, the object of the mitzvah, faran agbola, severe limitations. In fact, the only way the mitzvah could be done is only when it has those limitations. Firstly, there has to be a limitation on what is considered a mitzvah or not. You can't add a 614th mitzvah or delete one of the mitzvahs. There have to be boundaries. It says elsewhere in Torah, don't add. And that's completely is Talmud Torah, completely different when it comes to Torah learning, where the whole thing is where the whole goal of Torah learning is to constantly add in understanding, add in breadth of knowledge, add in networking different ideas. And that's actually brought in the practical halachas of how you learn Torah. So mitzvahs have to have those boundaries. These are the mitzvahs, they're no more, they're no less. And more specifically, each individual mitzvah has its boundaries. Tefillin has to, for example, be dafka fir parashas. You can only have 4 Torah portions inside a tefillin. If you have 5, it's no longer kosher. It's actually counterproductive, it's actually an aveira. Therefore, is by gavra von andere mitzvahs. So if mitzvahs are finite commodities, then it makes sense that the practitioners of the mitzvahs, Moruv din Tovin, should have dasei for menucha. They should have a time when they can rest, because the mitzvah is done, it's complete. You can't do more of it. You've put on tefillin today, you can't put on tefillin again. Das heißt, die zwei von dem Menucha ve'in Menucha seien behesam zu die zwei Bechinos, Gvul or bli Gvul. So it doesn't really seem to make sense to us that the tzaddikim, the people whose their primary connection to Hashem is through mitzvahs, should not rest, because that sounds like something which belongs to bli Gvul, an infinite experience which is unique to Torah, whereas the finite experience, which is also available through mitzvahs, should be just that, finite, and there should be a time we can say, I'm done, I'm good, I can now rest and appreciate the rewards of my efforts. So now that we understand that we're talking about 2 concepts, the finite or infinite experience, let's see if it's as simple as we say. Now that we've identified that the commodity of Torah is infinite, and the commodity of each individual mitzvah and mitzvahs as a whole is finite, now let's talk about the person, the practitioner. When it comes to fulfilling the mitzvah of learning Torah, there are no limits. Let's look, for example, in the Shein HaRambam, what the Rambam very famously says about Torah learning, that Kol Ish Yisrael Chai V'Samud Torah, that every single Jewish person is obligated to learn Torah, Bein Ani, Bein Asher, no difference if the person is poor or rich. So those limits, those restrictions are out the window. Bein Shalom Begufa, Bein Bal Yisurin, where the person's in perfect health or suffering. Those restrictions go out the window, etc. Also in terms of time, there are no time limits. We say, okay, now I no longer have to learn Torah at this particular time. So the practice of Torah learning has none of these restrictions. And the Shabbat is by mitzvahs. Now compare that to mitzvahs, which are completely different. Every mitzvah has its particular restrictions. Tefillin, not at night. Matzah has no value during the rest of the year. Is in a bestimmten Zman oder Mokum und das gleich, right? Either it's got a particular place, a particular time, a particular size, or a particular amount of times you can do it, etc. Okay, so what do we have? Torah is the world of the infinite, and therefore makes sense that the practitioners of Torah have infinite growth and they never rest. Mitzvahs is the world of the finite, and it makes sense, therefore, that in the world of mitzvahs, you can eventually surely turn around and say, we can rest now. In which case, like dem is aber schwer zu verstehen, so then we have a big question. The time from the Girsa Shita Tzadikim ein lo menucha chulei. Why is there a version in the Gemara, which obviously represents a whole philosophical approach, that those whose primary focus is mitzvahs also reach a point of never resting? Now we said Tzadikim could well incorporate people whose primary focus is only mitzvahs and not Torah learning. So, how is it possible if their area of operations is in a finite reality, mitzvahs, should produce an infinite result, that they never rest and are constantly progressing, which indicates lack of limits or restrictions, or infinite ability. So we obviously have to dig deeper and say, as mitzvahs is do a'inyan, there has to be something about mitzvahs on the maila, which also has the advantage from bli gvul of infinity. There has to be an infinite component to mitzvahs. Was damit is moving the time from the Gisa tzaddikim, which would justify the version that says even tzaddikim, who are the people who practice mitzvahs and not necessarily Torah, also have an infinite experience of constant growth even beyond this world. Now we need to understand what that is. We'll try a particular angle. The Rebbe will show that this angle does not actually express how mitzvahs have an element of being infinite, and so we'll have to find another explanation. The Chayre is da nor zu sagen, maybe the easiest way to explain it would be as the din mevaten Talmud Torah mipnei mitzvah sheyev shel asayis al yedei acherim. We all know the halacha says that if a person has a mitzvah to do that nobody else could do, then they suspend their Torah learning in order to do the mitzvah. So maybe it's machriach zu sagen, dass mitzvahs haben eicha bechina von bligvul. Maybe that would indicate absolutely that mitzvahs have an infinite component to them. Because if the mitzvah was only restricted and finite, how could finite mitzvah override infinite Torah? That wouldn't make sense. So surely that is proof that mitzvahs also have an infinite component which gives them the right, under certain circumstances, to override infinite Torah. But it's not really a good argument. It's not a proof at all. To show us the greatness of mitzvahs and the infinite value of mitzvahs. Because the truth is, this principle that you suspend Torah learning to do a mitzvah that you can't do otherwise is actually a law that relates to Torah study, not to mitzvah observance. In other words, the fact that you suspend doing your Torah learning in order to do a mitzvah is not because the mitzvah is so powerful it can displace Torah. But rather because if this person doesn't do this mitzvah, their Torah study will be shown to be imperfect. Why does this person have to do the mitzvah right now? To consolidate their Torah learning. In other words, it's because of the greatness of the Torah learning. How so? So the Alter Rebbe sagt in dem Tam von Eben dem Monten Din, the Alter Rebbe in Hilchos Talmud Torah, when explaining why it is that you pause your Torah learning to do a mitzvah that nobody else could do, he explains it as follows: Yafsik Talmud v'yaseh ha-mitzvah. You're supposed to pause learning and do the mitzvah. Ki zeh kol ha'adam, because that is the entire purpose of people. Meaning, Chachamim told us, Tachlis Chochma, the objective of all wisdom, i.e. Torah learning, is tshuva u'maisim tovim, that it translates into action. So therefore, if a person has a mitzvah that nobody else could do, and they don't do the mitzvah, they don't produce the action, that would indicate that this person didn't learn properly, because what's the whole purpose of learning? To translate it into action. And this person is not translating it into action, and therefore it would be better if such a person was never created. So we're back to square one. We don't yet have any indication of where the infinite value of mitzvahs could be found. Now, the fact that the Alter Rebbe says this in 2 points. First, he says the positive side of it. That the reason you should stop learning and do a mitzvah, there's a positive reason for it, because that's your entire purpose, to actually translate the theory into practice and do the mitzvahs. The fact that is there moisif, that he then adds the other side of it. And if you don't actually stop learning to do the mitzvah, that would be terrible, because it would reveal to us that the intention behind the learning was not appropriate, wasn't action focused. In other words, if the person doesn't do the mitzvah, clearly the Torah learning is not the way it's supposed to be. Es mashmas the tam ki zekol adam is nit genug. That indicates that the reason, that the whole purpose of being human is to do mitzvahs, is actually not enough reason as to live them so the mitzvah Talmud Torah to justify that a mitzvah should displace Torah. For a man, mestakas kima mitzvahs is kol ha'adam. Yes, it's true that the entire purpose of our lives is to do mitzvahs. But because, as we've identified, every mitzvah has its restrictive clauses and therefore is finite, so therefore is it nit doiche sein azach Torah was is blikvul. That's not going to give it the power to override Torah, which is infinite. So just because I have the responsibility and I'm created to do mitzvahs doesn't empower my mitzvah to be stronger than my Torah learning. Therefore, the Faris Alter Rebbe, Mosif, therefore the Alter Rebbe has to add, if the person doesn't do the mitzvah, then the learning isn't the way that it should be, and that's the only justification to stop learning in order to do a mitzvah. Das says, in other words, as kiyama mitzvahs, fulfilling mitzvahs, which is the entire purpose of our lives, and our whole life, including our intellectual capacity, which of course is usually where you'd find the person engaged in Torah. And he quotes what the Chachamim say, that the ultimate tachlis, the purpose was tachlis meint euch the shleimus von Chochmah. Not only the goal of Chochmah, but the completion of a Chochmah process is tshuva ma'asim tovim, translating it into meaningful action. And therefore, it turns out that because the mitzvah is what brings the learning to its completion and perfection, das says Torah, is if a person doesn't translate their learning into action and won't do the mitzvah that's going to pass them by, then their Torah learning is no good, because their Torah learning was not focused on what it is intended for to do. So, back to square one, how do we say tzaddikim ein lo manucha? How do we suggest that people whose engagement with Hashem is primarily through mitzvahs, that they have no rest in the next world, they have an infinite experience? How is that possible if mitzvahs are finite? Shlomo, as the being them is, so let's explain, in mitzvahs that there are two factors that you have to consider when you analyze a mitzvah. And we see it, we see it in the language we use for the brachas over mitzvahs. There's a common denominator that runs through all mitzvahs, that Hashem sanctified us, made us holy through His mitzvahs. And then on the Chelek HaMichud Prati, then there's the individual part that is unique to each mitzvah, Vetzivonu, that David commanded us, mitzvah ploin is X, to do this particular mitzvah. In other words, firstly, every mitzvah has its unique parameters. And those parameters will distinguish between tefillin and tzitzis and matzah and a lulav. That is the element of the mitzvahs that makes each one of them finite. It's a lulav, it's not a matzah. In addition, and beyond that base, there'll be the tzad hashove was is doing ala mitzvahs. There is the overarching common theme and energy of all mitzvahs, which is was machasdem, that I'm doing what Hashem wants. Was machasdem zayin say b'chinas bli gvul. That gives mitzvahs an infinite component. So now we're starting to move towards an answer. Mitzvahs are not black and white. There is a finite element and an infinite element. Das heißt, in other words, die verschiedene Protim was zayin doing jede mitzvah. All of the specific details that apply to a particular mitzvah. The tefillin have to be cubed, they have to be black, they have to have 4 parashios. The matzah has to be produced within 18 minutes, etc. Was durch sei is ausgeteilt der mitzvah legabe andere mitzvahs. All of those details are what distinguish one mitzvah from the next. In sei drückt sich aus die Hagbole was in mitzvahs. They are there to construct the framework that has its limited nature of this mitzvah. The nekuda haklolis, but the general principle of every mitzvah, was gefindt sich in alle mitzvahs, which is equally found in every single mitzvah, was alle seine mitzvah von l'shein tzivoy, which is the fact that they are instructions or commands. Das heißt der Ratzon ha'elyon baruch hu, which means every single mitzvah, big, small, regular, rare, is Hashem's will. Was ist voran Gleichheit in alle mitzvahs. That is identical in every mitzvah. It doesn't matter if it's a mitzvah that you do once in a yovel, or it's a mitzvah you do every single day. It doesn't matter if it's a mitzvah that costs a fortune, or a mitzvah that you could do easily, a mitzvah that you really care about, or a mitzvah that you think is not so important. What's common right throughout all of them, every mitzvah equally is what Hashem wants. Warum der Eibishter's Ratzon was in the mitzvahs is Hecher von seiner Agbolos und Ischalkos. The Eibishter's will that designed and motivated these mitzvahs is way beyond the specifics and the details. As the Medrash famously tells us, we shouldn't sit weighing up the value of one mitzvah against another. This is the least strict mitzvah, that's the most severe mitzvah. And once I examine a mitzvah from the perspective of its overarching thematic message, that it's the Eibishter's will, then every mitzvah is absolutely infinite. Let's take it a step further. This is a beautiful explanation why it is that when a person is busy with one mitzvah, they no longer have to fulfill other mitzvahs. It's a beautiful concept. Why should that be? Well, you can't weigh up mitzvahs, so why does this mitzvah get to displace that mitzvah? It's because every mitzvah is enmeshed with all the other mitzvahs. There's like this network of the spiritual veins of all the mitzvahs that interact with each other. So if a person right now is doing a mitzvah, in a certain way, it is like they're involved with all the other mitzvahs because they're all interconnected. Therefore, doing this mitzvah exempts me from the other mitzvah. Because the reason for that is because the primary essence of a mitzvah is to do what Hashem wants. Right now, I'm doing what Hashem wants. There may be something else that Hashem wants as well, but it's okay. I don't have to run to that because right now I'm doing what Hashem wants. So what happens? That even when a person is engaged with this particular mitzvah, even though if you examine the details of this mitzvah, it is so distant and different from the other mitzvah. The fact that I'm doing a mitzvah hyperlinks me to every other mitzvah. And that's the big gvul, that's the element of mitzvahs that is completely supernatural and therefore infinite. So now when we spoke about this originally with regards to Torah, we said that the Torah product is an infinite product, and the experience of learning Torah is an infinite experience. You can do it anytime, anywhere, all circumstances. So in the same way as now we're analyzing in mitzvahs that the product of a mitzvah has a finite and infinite component, we can likewise identify a similar trend in the performance of mitzvahs by the person. Yes, of course, every mitzvah has its parameters of time and space and who's obligated to do it and where you do it, etc. What is consistent and therefore infinite is the ongoing responsibility that each of us has to do mitzvahs. Yes, the specific mitzvah I can do at this time is specific to this time. But the principle of doing mitzvahs, that's something that applies to me all the time. Like the Mishnah tells us in the end of Masechta Kiddushin, my entire purpose, the whole reason I was created, is to serve the Eibishter. In other words, to do his ratzon. That means every moment that I am an existing creation, every single moment of a person's existence is for a purpose, serving the Eibishter. Like we said from the Alter Rebbe, this is the entire purpose of being a human. To the extent that the halacha is that everything we do should be directed towards heaven, as the pasuk says, in everything that we do we should recognize Hashem. So there's a finite component of what this mitzvah is when it applies and how I do it, and there's an infinite component of I am always in the service of Hashem. That will help us to explain the two versions or approaches as to who exactly doesn't rest in the next world. If I'm looking through the lens of mitzvahs as they are distinct from each other with their unique finite parameters, is not Talmidei Chachamim ein lehen menucha chulei. Well, then in that case, only Talmidei Chachamim have no rest in the next world, because only Torah has the infinite component. But when I look through the lens of the overarching theme and purpose of all mitzvahs, which is an infinite purpose to constantly serve Hashem, then all tzaddikim, including those people whose area of expertise is mitzvahs, all have access to an infinite experience in the time of Mashiach, which is the experience of never resting and constantly growing and developing. Okay, still one point to clarify though. Something else needs to be clarified. There's a concept that says, why is it the Torah scholars don't rest neither in this world or the next? Is based on an interpretation of the Arizal which goes like this. The Arizal says, this process of the Talmidei Chachamim constantly moving in the next world is related to a pasuk that basically says you continue doing there what you did here. Pasuk is that a person goes out to his work. Now we normally understand that a person goes to work through the day and comes back at night. Says the Arizal, what does it mean? It means as follows: when a person goes out, he goes back to work on what he worked on in this world, which is to engage in Torah learning. Because when a person leaves this world, the first thing that the person goes to do is more of what they were engaged in this world. To learn Torah, because that's what the person achieved while they were alive. And therefore, following that logic, is no Talmidei Chachamim. Only Torah scholars are the ones who don't rest in the next world, because Yeitzei Adam leFa'aloi, you go to continue what you were doing before. What was he doing? Learning Torah. So therefore, in the next world, he continues to learn Torah. Because when you get to Gan Eden, which is where the person goes when they leave this world, the only thing you can do in that next world is Torah learning. There's no opportunity to fulfill mitzvos in Gan Eden. So who gets to keep on learning, developing, growing, and elevating in the next world? The Talmid Chacham. Because Torah is currency in the next world. Mitzvahs are not applicable. So if that's the case, based on what the Arizal is telling us, we're back to square one. We don't understand the Girsa von Tzadikim v'chulei. How do we say that they are Tzadikim, which may include people who are not brilliant Torah scholars and just committed to mitzvahs, that they have no rest in the next world? Yes, the principle of constantly upgrading along the spiritual spectrum in the next world is something that would also apply to somebody who only does mitzvahs. Because as we've said, mitzvahs also have an infinite component to them. But how could we suggest that the fact that tzaddikim have no rest in the next world is how would it fit with our Arizal, who says that you go on to continue what you were doing in this world? In Gan Eden, there are no mitzvahs to do in Gan Eden. How do you continue doing what you did? In this world, you were a brilliant Maruv Din Tabin. You did this incredible job of mitzvahs. How does it translate into the next world? So therefore we have to say, well, what do we mean when we speak about the next world? We know when we say Olam Haba, there are two ways we could explain it. Aleph, Gan Eden. We could say it's referring to Gan Eden. And we could say, why is it called the next world? Because it follows life in this world. Or base, we could say it's Olam Atchiyah, the world after the time of Mashiach, at the time of the resurrection of the dead. And both are valid references to Olam Haba, and that's why you always have to be so conscious when you read things about Olam Haba to know the context. Okay, with that in mind, as the Pirush from Olam Haba in Dem Ma'amir Azal is told in its figure sois. Then we can say the two versions in the Gemara will take the two possibilities of what Olam Haba is referring to. The version that says it's the Torah scholars who don't rest in the next world and they keep growing and elevating, well, that would be they must be referring to Gan Eden when they speak about the next world. And Gan Eden is only an arena for continued Torah learning, not for mitzvah observance. So who gets to grow and keep moving there? The Torah scholars. Whereas the other version that says all tzaddikim have no rest, which includes even those who are primarily engaged in Torah in mitzvah observance, is the Taish von Elam Haba in the Ma'amir Azal Elam Atchiyah. Then when we're talking about the next world, we're talking about after Mashiach comes and after the resurrection. And then you could do mitzvahs as well. Is it that simple? Are there mitzvahs at that time? Surely we could ask, firstly, that in the future, in the time of Olam Haba, mitzvos will be obsolete. And the Alter Rebbe teacht, the Alter Rebbe says, which Olam Haba are we referring to over there? The time of Tchias HaMesim. So how can you say that Ein Lo Menucha, that they'll again re-engage with mitzvahs in the time of Tchias HaMesim? There are no mitzvahs to engage with then. Plus, base is Mavur B'cham Mekoymes in Chassidus. There are various places in Chassidus that tell us the fact that we talk about tzaddikim having no rest, and they consistently move from level to level to level, in Gan Eden. That is specifically referencing the kind of growth and development and upgrades that will happen in Gan Eden. But in the time of Mashiach, specifically Tchias HaMesim, that's it. That's it. You're going to rest forever. You don't even go through the upheaval of being upgraded from one spiritual level to the next. So how then are we going to use the argument that we just tried to use as like the Girsat that the version of Gemara that says tzaddikim will be reawakened to further growth and development in the next world, is not discussing Gan Eden, but rather the world of resurrection. Is the B'rin Dem's explanation is, guess what? Even the time of Olam Atchia, the Asid Lavoi, is also in stages and phases. The time of the resurrection has two eras to it. The erste Tkufa is Divas, if you're sagt, Yeder Id. When we refer to the first of those stages, what we all say in our Musaf on Yom Tov, that we'll bring karbanos as the Eibishter wants. In others, we'll do mitzvahs. Certain mitzvahs we can't even do today will be reinstated. And therefore, tzaddikim will again have the upgrades and the elevations that mitzvahs bring. And then subsequently, there'll be another phase and stage where mitzvahs will become obsolete. From the Raya Seftem, we can bring one of the possible proofs for this. We know the Gemara tells us that in the future, Moshe and Aaron will be with us, and we'll bring karbanos together with them, which is obviously Kiyam mitzvahs. That's a fulfillment of a whole lot of mitzvahs. Besides the fact that a korban is the concept of aliyah, elevating components of the physical world to a higher state. The life of an animal that was animal now becoming very elevated. As we explain extensively in Chassidus, connecting animals to their shorish, etc. So there you have it clearly that even after the time after Tchias HaMesim, there will still be the practice of mitzvahs, and there will still be the elevation of neshamas. So therefore you can say there are two stages. So the tzaddikim will grow in that initial stage of liyasid lavai and not in the subsequent stage. But still, we need to clarify this further. The concept of saying that tzaddikim or tamidei chachamim have no rest that implies that there's constant movement, never stopping, never breathing, never pausing, moving, elevating, higher and higher. And now when we're describing that if we're going to say tzaddikim have no rest in the next world, we're referring to Atkufa von Olam Atchia, a stage within the world of resurrection. Well, then there was a break. Ein lo menucha means you never rest. You go straight from working in this world to working in the next world. If the next world we're referring to is the time of the resurrection, well, in between they were in Gan Eden, and in Gan Eden they did rest, certainly from mitzvahs. Because you couldn't do mitzvahs in Gan Eden, and that's for sure an intermediate stage between our world and the world of Tchiyah. So how do you say Ein lohem menucha? They never rest. They do rest. Fascinating explanation about the concept of time and how it works in the higher realms is the Asbara in them. So we already mentioned as Asiyas HaMitzvahs is Shayach Nor in Olam Hazeh. We already defined that the only way you can fulfill a mitzvah is on earth. And in order to do that, you need when the neshama is ongeton in aguf, you need a neshama inside a body. That is the only environment in which a mitzvah is viable. But when the neshama is in Gan Eden, but when a neshama floats around in Gan Eden on aguf without the human body, it's not shaykh the avodah for mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are not applicable. It's non-start. It's not that there are mitzvahs to do, but you're not doing them. There's no concept of mitzvahs. Und for that reason, in shaychas to the avodah for maruv din tov and tzadikim, if we're talking about the world of doing good deeds, of doing mitzvahs, was die avodah kann gemalt sein nur dann, wenn die neshama ist zusammen mit dem guf, which is a world that is only possible and viable when the neshama lives inside the body. It says man from the neshama bli haguf. Then any time that the neshama is removed from the body, when he is in Gan Eden, nit kein mitzvos. That time frame doesn't exist. It's not part of the conversation. And there's a great way to explain it. In Klora Verta Klira, Kiyam ha-mitzvahs verbunden over Melem muss haben Kiyam haguf. The idea of fulfilling a mitzvah requires the existence of a body. And when the guf is nit kaim, if there is no body in the picture, als haguf le-nishmase, the body is not facilitating and housing the neshama, then the concept of time doesn't apply at all in that reality. And here's a great example. Sorry, we'll get to the example in a second. And so therefore the fact that the people who engage with mitzvahs in this world don't elevate during the time that they're in Gan Eden, has nothing to do with that their growth has been temporarily suspended, because it's not shaykh. It could never enter the space at all, can't enter the conversation. Now, if that sounds abstract, look at the example. Adugma dazu. Der Chof sagt, the Chof has a fascinating perspective. As long as the neshama is on high, there's no aging. What does that mean? Das heißt, as soon as the connection between body and soul is severed, and the neshama is in Gan Eden, and the neshama elevates to Gan Eden, is demelt in ihr Welt nito de ganze Inyan von Zman in Bezug zu Dinei HaTorah. Then for that period of time, the concept of time is irrelevant from an halachic point of view. Even though the concept of time may have an impact on the rewards for mitzvahs, learning Torah, etc., as we know that just like Chatzos down here on earth is a very special, unique time, so Chatzos midnight is also a special time in the context of neshamas. So in other words, let's put it this way. If somebody dies at the age of 86, and they die 200 years before Mashiach comes, when Mashiach comes along, and they have Tchias HaMesim, do they get up as a 286-year-old? No, they get up as an 86-year-old. In other words, as long as the neshama and the body are detached from each other, there is no passage of time. If there's no passage of time, then there cannot be a pause of time. So Eloi Menucha, the tzaddikim in this world, they're doing mitzvahs as long as they're in this world. Then there's a pause where nothing moves, nothing happens, nothing is considered. Then they are resurrected, and the clock starts again. Eloi Menucha, they have no rest as well. Another angle on the same concept of how you've got this strange relationship between time on earth, which has no bearing on time in Gan Eden, yet on the other hand, there is an element of the reality of mitzvahs that still exists in Gan Eden. So by Shlomo Bazek Chakadmur Mershab Nishma Seiden, about Yom Haledes from Chof Cheshvan, the Rabbi Shab, whose birthday is Chof Cheshvan, when the Sikha is dedicated, schreibt in sein Tzavah, writes an intriguing concept in his Tzavah. It's actually abbreviated over here. Perhaps you could say on a deeper level, in the name of my father, that when a tzaddik gomer is in Gan Eden, which is really the world of Memale Kol Omin, limited energy and light, and therefore no performance of mitzvahs, because mitzvahs belong to the world of Soviv Kol Omin, for a great tzaddik, even in Gan Eden, they have access to a glimpse, a taste of the experience of Soviv Kol Omin. And therefore it is possible, even in Gan Eden, to do something that is akin to doing a mitzvah. Fascinating concept. And it's a little similar to how mitzvahs will be in the future. For example, the fact that an neshama in Gan Eden can fulfill kibud avayim, the Gan Eden by elevating the parents into Gan Eden. Effectively, what the Rebbe Rashab describes over there is, if a person engaged in kibud avayim in this world and really did it properly, then when the neshama goes to Gan Eden, the value of the kibud avayim that they did, as well as the value of the other mitzvahs that they did, elevates the neshamas of the parents. So, what's kibud avayim? Showing respect and adding value to your parents' life. Here you have a neshama that is disembodied in Gan Eden and still adding value to the parents' lives. So there's a taste of a mitzvah even in Gan Eden. So what we're seeing of here is a really paradoxical reality. On the one hand, time is of no consequence to the neshama, so the neshama doesn't have a pause in its growth because there is no time measuring the possibility of growth. And yet on the other hand, there's actually the possibility of some degree of growth, as the Rebbe Rashab says, that there's a mitzvah component that could still be active even after a person's in Gan Eden. Shlema as das der pnimistika pirush von die Werte von Rambam bezel shoynoi, and this might be this is a whole deeper perspective of something the Rambam says. What does he say? The original Chachamim told us the world to come is not a physical place. It doesn't have any of the experience of the physical world. But it's a place where tzaddikim, so to speak, sit. Doesn't mean physically sitting. It means a place where they're in a settled state of being. And they have crowns on their heads, and they enjoy the radiance of the Shechina. Says the Rambam, this illustrates she'ein sham guf, that there is no body that exists in Gan Eden. From the Rambam Taisha Mabon, the Mamir Azal, Gan Eden, as we well know, the Rambam's perspective is that Olam Haba actually refers to Gan Eden. And when it says they're wearing crowns, which sounds very physical, he means that's actually this incredible insight and knowledge where concepts they learned in the world suddenly become so real to them. Das. That's their crown. Like the pasuk says about Shlomo HaMelech, the crown that his mother made for him on the day of his wedding. Just like that was referring to Matan Torah, which is all about knowledge of Hashem, so to the so-called crowns that we have, the tzaddikim also refers to knowledge. What does it mean that they enjoy the radiance of the Shechina? It means they understand and comprehend Hashem, the truth of God, to an extent that they could never understand and appreciate as long as they were in the lowly, finite human body experience. So what's the Rambam saying? As the Kavona is, in Gan Eden, the Rambam's identifying for us that Gan Eden has two very different experiences. On the one hand, that's an experience of a crown. A crown always represents something which is higher than the head, surrounds the head, it's beyond the mind, it's beyond the whole experience of the human being. It's access to something which is fundamentally greater than ourselves. And that would represent having access and appreciation of the light, the energy and radiance of Hashem, which is called Sovev, that is completely beyond the entire created reality, and they can appreciate it. And then you have the concept of, he says, they appreciate godliness, and they comprehend godliness. That's totally different. That's in the brain. That represents how they're constantly growing in their appreciation and learning of Torah in a very personal, meaningful way. So there are two realities happening in Gan Eden. A reality that causes growth and a reality that's completely beyond the individual. So now that we've identified that in Gan Eden there is some kind of flavor, taste of the fulfillment of mitzvahs, either the example the Rebbe Rashab gave about some degree of kibbud avayim, or what the Rambam's telling us, that there's the sovev kol olmin energy which is usually reserved for mitzvahs, yet it is accessible in Gan Eden. Therefore we can conclude, as a kol ponim tzadikim gemurim ein leim menucha, that the ultimate stage of a tzaddik, not just a regular tzaddik, but tzaddikim gemurim, the ultimate type of tzaddik, ein lo menucha, they don't rest. Even their mitzvah activity continues. Afilu in Gan Eden, even in Gan Eden. They're at such a high level that they experience some kind of a mitzvah taste, residue, glimmer even in Gan Eden, and they really have ein lohem menucha. They really never stop in their growth, not only by virtue of the Torah that they've learned, but also for the mitzvahs that they've done, all the way to the time of Tchias HaMeisim, which in Mitzvah Hashem we should be zocher to see, taken from Yad Mamash.